Welcome back to the I Believe podcast. I'm Megan, and I am joined today with Nathalie Riebel from Oncospire Consultants. Hi, Nathalie.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so thrilled to have you as a guest today. So, first, tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about, and then tell us about your background.
Yeah, so what I'd like to talk about today is really the patient voice in clinical trials. Clinical trials have changed so much in the last 30 years, and we're at a point now where, this time last year, the FDA approved 14 oncology drugs, believe it or not, like in the first quarter of 2024. And a lot of those require patient voice. So I'd like to talk about the patient voice today.
I love that. Thank you for being here. I think this is such an important topic and so relevant to everyone in our community.
Agreed. And I'll just introduce myself and maybe talk a bit how I met Melody, who's the founder of Ocular, the president right now of Ocular Insight.
And founder. Yeah.
And founder. So my name is Nathalie Riebel. I am now the owner and founder of Oncospire Consultants. And I spent 30 years working for large pharma, small biotechs, and decided last year to go off on my own and create a firm dedicated to really accelerating the development of drugs and improving access to new medicines. Because I found that there was a gap in, how long small companies took to get their medicines to market. And I have an expertise in clinical development operations and project management. And I wanted to give them kind of a fit for purpose consulting service so that they can get their drugs and move forward in their portfolio with the same advantages that a large pharma would have.
That's amazing.
Well,
no, that's amazing.
It's the dream.
Yeah.
It's the dream. It's the hope. So I've been working with a few really small clients that, university professors that discover drugs in their laboratories and want to take it onto the market, but getting on into like writing an investigational new drug for the FDA, a dossier, and doing all the steps that are required by the regulations in our industry, take knowledge. And somebody who's never done it, it's daunting and overwhelming.
Yeah, I wouldn't even know where to begin to start.
And for patients, kind of from the patient's point of view, it's clinical trials is, like I said, 14 oncology drug approvals in the first quarter of 2024. If you think about it, those drugs started 8 to 10 years ago. So somebody who right now might be in remission of their cancer might have contributed that study 8 to 10 years ago. So it's not an instantaneous industry where, what you do today, you will see tomorrow or in a month or in a year. It might take up to 5 years before you see that drug come on the market. Patients are so important. And I think they are the participants in our trials, and their voice is, I find, not heard enough. But I understand that when you've just been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, clinical trials is not the first thing you want to hear.
Right.
And it's not really, you're overwhelmed, you're grappling with fear, uncertainty, the need to make impossible decisions. The last thing is kind of going into something that feels unknown, uncontrollable, or even more uncertain. And yet, like I said, clinical trials are, a way of getting these drugs, which we're developing, to the patients early and in a free, accessible way with very strict oversight from the doctors. It's an advantage, But I understand from an emotional point of view, it can be really hard. And the process is confusing. There's a lot of paperwork. That's why, when I met Melody, groups like A Cure in Sight actually help patients, help connect the clinical trials and the patients. And I think that's such an important connection and gap to fill.
No, I totally agree.
So I met Melody when I was working as a vice president of a company that was developing a drug device for ocular melanoma. And she had invited me to her patient advocacy, I guess, conference to talk about our protocol and to kind of demystify clinical trials and our protocol in particular for patients. And I thought that was such an enriching experience for me because I got to learn how patients view the clinical trial, how it affects their lives. Often as scientists and drug developers, we're developing a protocol that, gets us the data we need to go back to like the FDA or other regulatory agencies to tell them how effective or safe the drug is. But in there, the patient's flexibility or kind of way of life has to fit in, right? If we say, oh yeah, we're going to take like blood samples every 3 hours for like 24 hours, well, that means somebody has to miss their job, has to find childcare, has to, make arrangements to be there, maybe make arrangements to get picked up, dropped off, and so forth. Or maybe they can't stay overnight somewhere because of, their caretakers or their, mothers and fathers of small children and stuff. And that's why the trend right now, and what I heard at my last conference, is really to get patients involved when we design these studies. So get their voice heard and say, hey, you know what? I'm happy to go to my local LabCorp and get samples drawn, but I'm not happy to go to the hospital where you're running the study and actually stay there for 24 hours.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And, it's important for us to, hear that as drug developers, because there's such a small fraction of people that actually go on clinical trials. It's a shame because everybody should know about clinical trials a little more to make a little bit more of an informed decision.
Sure.
I wanted to also kind of demystify what clinical trials are. It's such I think a stigma, right? You hear like people are guinea pigs and people are, test subjects, and there's movies made about it, and there's memes made about it. And it's actually all we want to do is make sure that the drug is worth developing. And as good drug developers, our motto is fail fast, because we want to be able to, if a drug isn't working, we want to be able to shut down that program right away and not expose people to that drug any longer than they need to be. What do you know about clinical trials?
So I'm a layman in this area. Not a lot. I know, like you said, that you're testing a drug to see if it's effective. And that's sort of my extent of the knowledge. And I can imagine as a patient, it is scary because you're already facing a diagnosis for a cancer that you probably don't know anything about. And then now they're saying, oh, do this test drug that you also don't know anything about. So I can imagine that would be a very overwhelming and scary place to be. And I think bringing them the information of what it is and what they can expect is a wonderful thing to kind of help guide them through this. So that's why we're so happy to have you here.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. And, I think most people do have like basic information like you do. And I think that's great. That's such a great start already to know, that it is a process for which that we use to make sure new medicines are safe and effective. And we always tell people, if they look in their medicine cabinet, the Tylenols, the Advils, the Aleve, and all those went through clinical trials. All those had to be tested to make sure they're safe. And now, people don't even think twice, right? When you take an Advil but there's people that at one point we didn't know what the dose was for Advil or how effective it would be, or if it caused what the percentage of side effects would be.
Right. Yeah. And now we don't think twice.
Right. The goal of, the regulators and the drug developers are always to get more benefit than risk. So more good than, bad effects for the drugs. And that's really what they look at when they decide whether a product is acceptable to go on the market, right? They kind of tally up how much good are you doing and how safe are you? So are you doing anything bad? And what's the tally? And if your bad kind of overshadows your good, they don't approve it.
Castle Biosciences is a proud sponsor of this I Believe podcast. Castle's innovative uveal melanoma tests provide valuable information about the risk of your eye cancer spreading to help you and your healthcare team individualize the management of your disease. To learn more, visit castlebiosciences.com.
I was thinking of maybe providing like a few basic questions that, you guys can ask as advocacy groups, or, the patients can ask if they want to go into clinical trials. If they get a diagnosis, and usually the doctor will allow the patient, some time to kind of come to grip with the diagnosis and everything. But patients should feel empowered to ask, is there a clinical trial? Like, what is the treatment kind of regiment that I'm destined for, given, the phase of my disease? And is there clinical trials that could help me? And the basic questions would be like, what is being tested and why? Because sometimes it's a device, sometimes it's a drug. It could be an injectable, it could be an IV, it could be a pill, so you want to know kind of what it is and why it's being tested. What are the risks? These are our terms. I say risks and benefits, but what do we know so far from the medicine that has been tested? What is the good that you've seen, and what is the bad that you've seen, right? Will the trial affect my quality of life and my day-to-day activities? Like, what is the normal day in the life of a trial participant look like? So do I have to come every day? Do I come once a week? Do I come once a month? And if I do volunteer for the trial, what happens if I leave the trial? So, that's a really important question, because life happens, right? Anything could happen. It doesn't have to be something that, the drug doesn't work, that's related to the drug. You could have a really joyous occasion where somebody's getting married in your family and you have to be away for, 3 weeks or 2 weeks. Destination weddings are so in now, right?
I'm a fan.
I'm a fan too.
Yeah.
You have to ask if there's any costs involved. Will you get the data when the trial ends? As a patient, I want to know kind of what my data went towards, and what kind of care will I receive. So sometimes, the trial might not be done by your doctor. It might be another doctor. So, the rules are that whoever's doing the trial needs to inform your primary care physician that this is happening, so that, everybody's aware that you're on a medication that isn't approved yet.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that's something that I just didn't even think about, is how do you do this program and relate it back to your doctor or your team of doctors, that communication, what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's now rules, and we give the patients what we call informed consents, and those are usually, unfortunately, now they've become like 14-page documents. But in there, it says that we are going to contact your primary care physician and any other physician you want us to contact to be able to tell them that you're participating on this trial. Because for some medications that are developed, you can't have like citrus fruit or green vegetables or poppy seeds, or you can't have certain other medications. So if you have a rash and you go to your doctor's, you're on a certain clinical trial, he might not be able to prescribe just any, dermal cream for your like minor ailment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they all need to be on the same page, and you need to have everybody aware of what's happening and communicating with each other.
Yeah, and the doctors that do the research, they have to be available to the patient constantly to be able to ask any questions. And I think patients have to realize that, oh, I don't know. I sometimes when I'm tired get a twitch in my eye, right?
Yep.
If I was on a clinical trial and the twitch started getting worse, I would definitely call the doctor and say, hey, this is normal for me, but it's gotten like, it happens usually once a week. Now it's like every day, right? And it could be something as just benign or something very, relevant that we have to understand.
So you really need to be vigilant and pay attention to your own body, because I think a lot of us are so busy in our daily life that we don't listen to our bodies. And so to really make that a point that you have to pay attention, that is something that you really have to be aware of going in.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, you're again going back to, the first point we talked about. You've just been diagnosed with cancer or another disease. You don't know what it feels like to have cancer. You're now introducing, so you're saying, is it my cancer that's doing this to me? Is it the drugs I'm getting, that's doing this to me? You're right. You have to be hyper vigilant and communicate a lot with your doctors.
And I think this is also where your caregiver comes in, because sometimes they'll see something that you don't see. And so making them aware of, hey, if anything looks out of the ordinary, let me know. Because a lot of times, you'll say something to, your spouse or your friend or whoever, and they're like, I do that? And you're like, oh, yeah, you do.
That is so true. And, you're right, because a good clinical trial will also usually have caretaker information.
Oh,
And
perfect.
I know a lot of the advocacy groups like you guys, often provide the caretakers with information so that they feel empowered and kind of part of the process.
And just seen. We see you and we see
Yes.
you.
Yes, because the caretakers are such a huge part. And that's why, again, going back to when we're designing these trials and just before they even, before even patients can come on the trial, it's, I know for the companies I've worked for and for the clients I worked for, it's really important to get in touch with advocacy groups and patient groups to say, hey, we're thinking of, designing the trial like this. It's going to last, 6 months or a year or 5 days. And this is, how we want to do it. Does this make sense to you with everything you have to grapple with, learning about a new disease, becoming incapacitated where your caretaker has to, step in to drive you everywhere or to make your meals or, so forth. I think it's really important for us to incorporate that patient voice when we're even before we go to the FDA and say, hey, we want to do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, most patients, like I said, they don't know it exists, or right away they say no, and they don't have to, even patients that say no to clinical trials shouldn't say no to be able to be on a panel that looks at a clinical trial.
Oh, so that's interesting. So I haven't heard about that.
Aura Biosciences is a clinical stage biotechnology company focused on developing precision therapies for solid tumors that aim to preserve organ function. Our lead candidate, Belsar, is currently in late stage development for primary choroidal melanoma and in early stage development in other ocular oncology indications and bladder cancer. Our mission is to grow as an innovative global oncology company that positively transforms the lives of patients. For more information, please visit us at aurabiosciences.com.
Yeah, so there's now companies that do that put together patient panels to look at patient documents. We want to, is this consent too complicated? Do you understand this consent? Because most of them, like I said, are because of regulations, they become really, really long because we have to describe everything, all the risks, all the benefits, but also every single test that we do in the study. And you can imagine if it's like a 6-month study or a year study, there's a lot of tests. So it's, they can just be on a panel and we ask them, does this consent look good? Do you think this financial stipend is acceptable for patients? We pay for maybe like just, $15 of parking and, a day of daycare. Some patients will say, no, I have to spend my whole day there. I want lunch, for me and my caretaker because, I'm missing work and things like that. So we need to have their perspective so that it does become more accessible, so that drug development doesn't take so long.
I love that. I love that you're listening and taking their consideration. Not only just listening, you're seeking it out. You're going out and saying, hey, we want you to tell us. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think more companies are trying to do it. It's what we've been asking companies to do. But again, for a small biotech, which, is maybe 3 guys in a garage that are just starting out, sometimes it's, how do we get these patients input, and I think that's where advocacy groups like you can help us connect with patients and say, hey, yeah, we'll ask somebody to look at the consent for a fee, but at least it won't be like a huge panel of people or that will that might put a financial burden on the small company.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And also, I think there's so many other things. We want to make trials. I've been talking about making trials less burdensome for patients, but also sometimes the eligibility criterias are really strict. And sometimes the FDA asks us to be really strict, but sometimes it's the company who's being really strict. And we want to make sure that everybody's represented and that we get to all types of patients. Right now, a lot of the sites that do research are academic sites or large hospitals in large cities. But what about the, small town of like 4,000 people in rural Montana? How do they get trials?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I know there's been efforts. So I don't know if you ever heard of angel flights. I have one of my neighbors actually did one last year. And I think Melody and I had talked about this because they're flights that they're volunteer pilots that will take patients from wherever they live to the treating hospital that they have to go to. So for one of the top hospitals kind of in ocular melanoma is Jefferson in Philadelphia. Well, if you live in, a small town in Missouri, how do you get there?
Right.
It's a long drive, it's an expensive flight. So these pilots actually take the patients to get care.
I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah. Having talked about all that, I feel like, we could spend a whole day talking about all the questions that patients could ask for clinical research, but they should, if people are curious about clinical research, they need to reach out to, Melody, who has access to people like me who I do it out of compassion for these patients, happy to answer any questions, and they should not feel like clinical trials is kind of a last resort, but it's an opportunity that they have to contribute to us understanding the disease, but also understanding why treatments work and why they don't. Sometimes we think we have like a breakthrough treatment and it just doesn't work.
I'm sure that it's a big decision to do one. And then if you decide you're going to do one, how do you decide which one?
Yeah, that's a great question because there are a lot. And I know there's a lot of sleuthing. I think from patients, sometimes patients will discover the site clinicaltrials.gov, which is a mandatory public website that the FDA has created, which lists every single clinical trial done in the US and some abroad as well. They will try to interpret, but it's a very scientifically based site. It gives you the scientific description of the trial and the eligibility criteria. And for some, they totally can manage with that. But I think it is trying to get to the advocacy groups, trying to be connected to maybe like a nurse navigator at the site. So there's a lot of sites that have nurse navigators that will look at the patient's profile and say, yeah, so in, head and neck cancer, there is right now 20 trials, but your specific profile kind of fits these 5. And, 3 of them are not close to here and 2 of them are close to here.
So that narrows it down for you.
Yeah.
So how do you find a nurse navigator?
I think that's still, it's an evolving position. So it's relatively new. It's been for the last maybe 7 years, we've had these nurse navigators. Sometimes they're associated with large hospitals. So like Jefferson has some here in Philadelphia and other large hospitals. But for a small rural hospital, I would think that, again, looking on the websites, I know that certain advocacy groups have chat rooms. So getting on some of the chat rooms. Also looking at, if you do go on clinicaltrials.gov, there are phone numbers there of study coordinators that are running the trial. And they can also help saying, I just got diagnosed with head and neck cancer. I'm interested in getting onto your trial. Is this a trial for me? And I know as when I was an executive, a VP of clinical operations, I would often get emails from patients that found us that way and would ask, is this for me? And we would refer them to a site or, a doctor that could talk them through privately and confidentially kind of through their disease and what would be good for them and so forth.
That's fantastic because I think that we need all the help we can get.
Yeah. It's any diagnosis of anything is difficult. And usually it's by surprise and emotions and things to deal with. Your whole life just has changed on a dime.
Absolutely. And it's a scary and overwhelming place to be. And so just having somebody step up and say, hey, I can help you, sometimes that's bigger than anything.
Yeah, and look, there's people, there's caretakers that have gone way beyond the kind of finding an advocacy group for their child with a rare disease. You know, I had the chance to meet somebody this weekend who her child had a rare disease, and she didn't find any support. So she created her own advocacy group, and then she found a drug that they had stopped development on for this disease because it wasn't profitable. And she actually formed a team, and they are developing this drug.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, there is ways of getting things done. I mean, that's an extreme case, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of nonprofits and, whether they're advocacy groups or new nonprofits that want to connect patients to trials or help patients find, the right care for their disease. So I think this year is really going to be the year of the patient voice.
I love that. And in that line of thinking, we have a registry that patients can join our registry. You can find it on our website, acureinsight.org. And if you don't want to do a clinical trial, or it's not for you, and you want your voice to be heard, you want your data to go into helping, please join our registry. We're about to publish the findings. So we're going to have a deadline day coming soon. We talked about it this morning, and I don't think we've picked what the deadline day will be, but it's going to be coming up. And if you want to be included in that before we publish, we'll post more information, but go to our website and do it now. Don't wait. And you can be a part of it.
That's fantastic, because those registries, before they weren't given too much weight, by like regulatory agencies. But in the last 3 years, what we're calling real world evidence, of these registries and of really all the data that's happening to patients, it's becoming more utilized, and we're looking at it, and we're also using it to design trials. So I love that. And anytime a patient can get on a registry and help science it's another way to contribute.
Yeah, and a way to contribute that you don't have to do anything except give a little bit of your time. And if you have any questions about the process, or you're not sure how to sign up, reach out to any of us and we'll walk you through it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you, talking about one of my passions. And again, I give my time to you and Melody whenever you want to help with support your patients and things like that. And in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me.
We appreciate that more than you know. And thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today and just talk about the importance of a clinical trial. And I think the questions to ask are so important, because somebody might say, here are the reasons you should do a clinical trial, but that doesn't mean they know how to go about starting the process. So I love that you gave some insight into what to look for, what to ask. I think that's really a great place for people to start.
Well, thank you. I had fun doing it.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. So I'm thrilled to have you here, and hopefully we'll have you back soon to talk about something else. Anything you want, let us know. We're open.
Okay, great.
We love to chat. And for everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in. This podcast doesn't function without your views, so please keep listening, watching. If you're on YouTube, you can watch it. Anywhere else, you can get this anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Podbean. So please subscribe, please like it, and please leave us a comment and let us know what you thought of this and what you'd like to see next. We're always looking for some ideas of what you guys want. Let us know and we'll bring it to you. And please subscribe to YouTube also. We are very close to monetizing, and once we monetize, we can bring you even more programs.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I know. It's very exciting. We're doing a lot of stuff right now, so we're really excited about it. So Everyone, please keep watching and listening, and we will see you all next time.